The icy winds howled through the narrow stone corridors of Bleow Castle in Bedfordshire, cutting through the frigid night like a blade. The year was 1457 AD, and within the castle's cold walls, a tragedy was unfolding. A young girl's scream echoed through the chambers, a sound that pierced the howling wind with unnatural intensity. Inside the dimly lit room, the flickering candlelight revealed the tense, agonized face of 3-year-old Margaret Beaufort. The child was already bloodied, gripping the sheets beneath her in a desperate effort to endure the torment of labor. The midwives hovered near her, whispering prayers in Latin, their faces tight with worry, their hands trembling as they offered no reassurance, only helpless murmurs in the flickering shadows. Outside, snow swirled on the ground, a scene of frozen serenity in stark contrast to the chaos inside. Margaret's body, still in the fragile throes of childhood, was under siege by a future king, her son, who would one day wear the crown of England as Henry VIII. But tonight, as her life hung in the balance, no one could predict that the child born in these desperate conditions would one day change the course of English history. The bloodied sheets beneath Margaret marked not just the pain of childbirth but the foundation of the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that would end the Wars of the Roses, a conflict drenched in the blood of the nobility, and reshape the world. Margaret's suffering was both physical and symbolic. The grim irony of her labor, as a child herself, echoed through history. She would survive this agony, against all odds, and bear Henry Tudor, the future king who would claim the throne and eventually break free from the chains of medieval England. But in that moment, none of this was known. The only thing certain was the young girl, her small body torn by the weight of both motherhood and destiny. In this room, with the cold creeping through every crack in the stone, a king was being born, and a queen mother was being forged. But at what cost? Margaret Beaufort's story begins long before the agonizing night at Bleow Castle. Her roots stretch deep into the soil of royal England, her bloodline interwoven with some of the most powerful families of the 15th century. Margaret was no ordinary girl. She carried the legacy of the English crown in her veins, tracing her ancestry to John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the fourth son of King Edward III. This connection, a double-edged sword, granted Margaret the allure of royal blood, but it also cast her into a world of political machinations, where her very existence could be used as a pawn in a game of thrones. Born around May 1443, Margaret was the daughter of John Bowfort, the first Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp, daughter of the wealthy and influential Beauchamp family. From the moment she took her first breath, the complexities of English politics were never far behind. Her father, John, had been a man marked by both brilliance and failure. A commander during the 100 Years' War, John's once glorious military career had ended in disgrace. His campaigns in France had faltered, and England's lost territories weighed heavily on him. Those who were closest to him whispered of his eventual mental collapse, some even spoke of poison. For in the political arena of the time, death by poison was as common as a sword's blade. When John Bowfort died in 1444, Margaret was barely a year old. The official cause of death was a fever, but such an explanation was always met with skepticism among the nobility. Rumors circulated that he had taken his own life, crushed by the weight of military failure and the shame of his broken legacy. His death was a loss for the Lancastrian faction, as it deprived them of one of their most powerful allies. For Margaret, it was the beginning of a turbulent childhood, one marked by the absence of her father and the challenge of growing up under the shadow of his failed reputation. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, quickly learned that survival in this cutthroat world meant seizing opportunities, no matter how small. She focused all her energy on securing a future for her daughter, understanding that marriage was the only way to ensure safety and survival for a woman in her position. And so, at the tender age of 6, Margaret was betrothed to John Depole, the son of the Duke of Suffolk, an alliance that would unite two powerful families. The marriage contract was a lifeline, a promise of stability amidst the chaos that surrounded them. Yet, in a world where politics shifted like the wind, Margaret's early betrothal would soon prove as fragile as the paper it was written on. John Beaufort's death marked more than just a personal loss for his daughter. It rippled through the entire political fabric of 15th century England. Margaret's early years were shaped by the haunting shadow of her father's fall from grace. His death was not just a familial tragedy, it was a political disaster that shook the very foundations of the Lancastrian cause. John's failure in France had left the English crown weakened and divided, and his death created a void in the military leadership of the Lancastrians. As Margaret grew, the whispers surrounding her father's untimely demise only added to the political intrigue. Some said he had succumbed to a fever, a natural death, but others hinted at something far more sinister, Could it have been poison? After all, the nobility of the time often fell prey to such lethal conspiracies. The absence of an explanation left room for speculation, and as with most things in court politics, rumors thrived where truth could not be definitively established. For Margaret, the loss of her father was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it cast her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, into a vulnerable position, forcing her to navigate the dangerous waters of English court politics without the protection of a powerful husband. On the other hand, it placed Margaret herself in the line of succession, a child whose bloodline tied her to the great dynastic struggle that would soon tear England apart, the Wars of the Roses. Her mother, a woman of formidable intelligence and ambition, wasted no time in securing the future of her young daughter. With John Bowfort gone, the Beauchamp family had to shift strategies. Margaret was the key to future alliances, and her marriage would become the weapon to protect both her and her family's interests. By the time Margaret was 6, her future was already sealed in a marriage contract with John Depole, the son of William Depole, Duke of Suffolk. The union would unite two of England's most powerful families, a political alliance that was meant to shield Margaret from the dangers surrounding her. But as with most plans in the volatile world of the Wars of the Roses, this one too was destined to unravel. In 1450, Suffolk, who had arranged the marriage, was brutally murdered. His downfall was tied to his controversial negotiations with the French during the reign of Henry VI. The marriage arrangement between Margaret and Depole, once a secure alliance, now lay in tatters. Suffolk's death left Margaret's prospects uncertain, her future once again hanging precariously by a thread. It was a brutal reminder of the dangers of court politics, where alliances could be forged and shattered with ruthless speed. The loss of this alliance at such a tender age should have been devastating. But Margaret's mother, ever pragmatic, wasted no time in searching for another way forward. She understood the rules of survival better than anyone. A woman could not rely on the past, but must constantly adapt to the shifting tides of fortune. The death of Suffolk proved to be a painful lesson in the fragility of noble marriages and the unpredictable nature of political allegiances in an England on the brink of civil war. By the age of 12, Margaret Beaufort had already learned a harsh lesson in the fragility of noble alliances. Her early betrothal had been dissolved in the wake of Suffolk's murder, and her future remained uncertain. However, in 1455 AD, Margaret's destiny took another sharp turn when she was married to Edmund Tudor, a union that would tie her to the Tudor family, the future royal house of England. Edmund, the half-brother of King Henry VI, was a man of some standing, though not of great wealth or power. His marriage to Margaret, however, was more than a personal connection. It was a strategic alliance forged to strengthen the Lancastrian cause amidst the growing turbulence of the Wars of the Roses. The wedding took place at Bleau Castle, the same stronghold where Margaret had spent much of her childhood, a place that would now become the backdrop to some of the most significant events of her life. The Great Hall, decorated with tapestries celebrating her ancestors, contrasted sharply with the grim reality of Margaret's own future. She was still a child, barely 12 years old, and yet, in the eyes of the nobility, she was already a valuable commodity, a political asset to be used in the fight for the throne. Edmund, at 25, was an experienced man, seasoned by war and the complexities of royal politics. For Margaret, this marriage was another step into a world where love was secondary to political necessity. The ceremony was performed with the usual pomp, but the emotional undercurrents of the marriage were anything but celebratory. Margaret was still a girl, not yet fully matured, and the marriage was consummated almost immediately. In an era when women were often treated as vessels for producing heirs, there was little concern for Margaret's emotional or physical readiness. Her body, still in the early stages of growth, was forced into a role it was not prepared for. The physical toll on her young body would be immense, and the marriage night was one of trauma, an experience she would never openly speak of, yet one that would leave deep scars on her psyche and body. But the political landscape of England was shifting, and tragedy was never far behind. Edmund Tudor's involvement in the civil strife of the Wars of the Roses soon saw him fighting against the Yorkist forces. In 1456, while Margaret was still adjusting to the realities of marriage and motherhood, Edmund was captured during a campaign in Wales. His capture was a blow to the Lancastrians, and his eventual death would have far-reaching consequences for Margaret and her unborn child. The circumstances of Edmund's death remain murky. Some accounts suggest that he died of disease in prison, while others whisper of foul play. What was clear, however, was that Edmund Tudor would never see his child born. Margaret was left a widow at the tender age of 13, pregnant with a child who would go on to become one of the most famous kings in English history. The news of Edmund's death reached her while she was staying at Lamp Palace in Pembrokeshire. The messenger arrived on a rainy November evening, the horse foaming with sweat from its frantic ride. Margaret, who had been praying in the chapel for her husband's safe return, knew something was wrong before the man even spoke. The future of her son, and the Lancastrian cause, now rested on her fragile shoulders. With Edmund gone, the responsibility of protecting her unborn child fell to her and her remaining family members. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, stepped in to ensure Margaret's safety. He took her to the safety of Pembroke Castle, a fortress perched above the crashing Atlantic waves, where she would face a new set of challenges. The political landscape was shifting rapidly, and the Wars of the Roses were escalating. Margaret, now a widow and an expectant mother, was caught in the crossfire of a dynastic struggle that threatened to tear England apart. As the harsh winter of 1456 began to set in, Margaret Beaufort found herself alone, vulnerable, and pregnant with a child who would one day change the course of history. The political landscape around her was rapidly deteriorating, and the Wars of the Roses, a bitter and brutal conflict between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, were intensifying. Margaret's widowhood, combined with her impending motherhood, placed her in an incredibly precarious position, one that would require every ounce of her resilience and intelligence to navigate. The journey to Pembroke Castle was an ordeal in itself. The winter roads were treacherous, and Margaret, nearing the end of her pregnancy, was not in a condition to endure such hardships. Yet, this was the world she inhabited, one where survival often required an indomitable will. As her litter made its way through the snow-covered Welsh countryside, each bump and jolt was a cruel reminder of the burden she carried, both physically and politically. Her body, still that of a child in many ways, was struggling under the weight of pregnancy, while her mind raced with the uncertainty of what the future held. Pembroke Castle, a fortress designed to withstand both sieges and storms, would provide refuge, but not comfort. It was a harsh and unforgiving place, perched high above the Pembroke River, its stone walls built to protect, not to nurture. Inside the castle, Margaret's physical suffering was compounded by the oppressive isolation. The cold seeping through the ancient stones, the howling winds battering the walls, and the endless days of confinement left Margaret to grapple with her fear of the coming birth, the dangers of childbirth, and the looming threat of civil war. The physician who attended her, Dr. Lewis Carlion, was experienced in the ways of childbirth, but even he could not mask the deep concern he felt for Margaret's safety. Her young body, still growing and unprepared for the demands of childbirth, was a source of great anxiety. Dr. Carlion had delivered many children, both queens and peasants, but the situation with Margaret was different. Her pelvis had not fully developed, and the baby was large and poorly positioned. The risks of childbirth were immense, and Margaret's life hung by a thread. For Margaret, the stakes were higher than simply surviving childbirth. Her son, the child she carried within her, represented the future of the Lancastrian cause, a dynasty on the brink of collapse. Her son was the symbol of a royal bloodline that had been battered by defeat and dishonor, but he was also the key to the hopes of the Lancastrian supporters. If Margaret did not survive, or if her son did not live, the future of the Lancastrians would be in jeopardy. This pressure weighed heavily on her young shoulders as she faced the unknown future. Margaret spent her days in the cold, stone halls of Pembroke Castle, her belly growing with each passing week, as the conflict outside seemed to grow ever closer. Her days were filled with prayers and preparations, and her nights were consumed by restless anxiety. In the quiet hours, as the wind howled and the sea battered the cliffs below, Margaret would retreat into her faith. The religious devotion that would come to define much of her life began to take root in these lonely hours. She prayed for the strength to survive, for the safety of her son, and for a way to navigate the political minefield that awaited her once the child was born. In the castle's chapel, Margaret spent hours kneeling before the altar, her prayers echoing in the empty space. She recited Latin prayers she had learned since childhood, words that brought some comfort but could not alleviate her fears. At the same time, she turned her mind toward the future, learning everything she could about the world of politics and diplomacy that surrounded her. She understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, that survival in this brutal world would depend not just on strength, but on cunning. Knowledge would be her greatest weapon, and as the months passed, Margaret began to develop a sharp political mind, one that would later serve her well in the treacherous battles ahead. As her due date approached, Margaret's physical condition worsened. Her body was exhausted from the journey, from the emotional strain, and from the relentless tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. Her health deteriorated, and the physician's worries grew with each passing day. Yet, despite the growing fears, Margaret remained determined to face whatever came next. She had already endured so much, and her strength of will was unmatched. She would not let her family's legacy fade so easily. The day came when Margaret could no longer ignore the signs of impending labor. The contractions began, and her body, frail and unprepared for the ordeal, was pushed to its limits. It was in these moments that Margaret's true character began to emerge. The future of her house, of the Lancastrian cause, depended on the survival of this child, this boy who might one day rule England. Margaret's pain became not just a physical trial, but a trial of her very willpower, a test of how much she could endure for the sake of the legacy she carried within her. As the bitter cold of winter deepened, and the days seemed to stretch endlessly before her, Margaret's labor pains intensified. With every passing moment, the risk of her body failing to deliver her son grew. Dr. Lewis Carlion, the physician at Pembroke Castle, had made it clear to Margaret's family and the midwives that the situation was dire. Her body was simply too young, too unformed to bear a child of such size. Her hips were narrow, her body still too much that of a child. The unborn baby, too large and wrongly positioned, was causing her excruciating pain and was at risk of distress or death. Margaret was caught in a battle between nature and politics, her life and the life of her child hanging in the balance. But even as her body was failing her, Margaret clung to the one source of solace she had left, her religion. The chapel in Pembroke Castle became her refuge during the long hours of labor. The flickering candlelight and the smell of incense mixed with the heavy scent of fear. Margaret had always been deeply religious, raised in a household where faith was a cornerstone of daily life. But the intensity of her devotion grew as the severity of her situation became clearer. Hours before her labor truly began, Margaret had spent time kneeling in prayer, her hands clasped tightly before the altar. Her whispers, fervent and desperate, echoed in the empty chapel as she prayed not just for the survival of her son, but for the strength to face whatever fate awaited her. The castle's priest, Father Meredith, was a constant presence during this time, offering prayers and blessings for Margaret's well-being and the safe delivery of her child. Father Meredith had been educated at Cambridge and understood the complexities of the world, but his faith and compassion were what guided him as he worked to comfort Margaret in her darkest moments. He too knew the dangers that lay ahead. Yet, his reassurances, while heartfelt, could not change the reality of the situation. As Margaret's labor pains grew more intense, the midwives, seasoned women who had seen countless births in their time, exchanged worried glances. They had witnessed the dangers of childbirth before, but this was different. Margaret was not a fully grown woman, she was still a child herself. They prepared their instruments with the grim efficiency of women who knew just how high the stakes were. Knives, forceps, hooks, and other tools were laid out on a wooden table beside the bed, while herbs and potions were mixed to ease the pain and calm the nerves. The air was thick with the smell of lavender and rosemary, each herb offering its own small comfort in a room heavy with tension. The screams of pain that tore through the stone walls of the castle were the sounds of a child giving birth to a child. Margaret's small body twisted in agony, each wave of pain pushing her closer to the edge of endurance. The midwives worked as carefully as they could, using every technique in their arsenal to ease her suffering. But there was little they could do to combat the physical limitations of Margaret's body. The night stretched on, and with each hour that passed, the anxiety within the room grew. Meanwhile, outside the door, Margaret's brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, paced nervously. The fate of the Lancastrian cause hung on this moment on whether Margaret, who was the last surviving member of the Bowfort line, would survive and deliver a healthy heir. Jasper understood the stakes. If Margaret died, or if the child died, the hopes of restoring the Lancastrian dynasty would fade, perhaps permanently. Henry VI, the Lancastrian king, was weak, and his reign was increasingly threatened by the Yorkists. The birth of Margaret's son was meant to be the rallying point for the Lancastrian supporters, a symbol of continuity for a family that had already suffered so much. Jasper had always been a loyal and protective figure in Margaret's life, but even he could not control the outcome of this harrowing night. The castle's walls felt as though they were closing in on him as he heard the faint echoes of Margaret's screams. He paced endlessly, his thoughts racing. He was still a relatively young man, barely in his mid-20s, and had already witnessed enough loss to last a lifetime. Now, the woman he had grown fond of, his brother's widow, was at death's door, fighting for the life of the child who might one day restore the fortunes of the Tudor family. His heart ached as he waited, helpless, for the outcome of the night. Inside the chamber, the midwives were doing their best to assist Margaret, but it was clear that her body was struggling beyond its capacity. As hours passed, Margaret's strength began to fade. Her small body, overwhelmed by the immense pain, became weaker and weaker. the decision was made that something more drastic would need to be done. The possibility of a cesarean birth, a procedure that was almost always fatal to the mother, was discussed in hushed tones by the physician and midwives. It was a decision they hoped to avoid, but it seemed the only option left if they were to save the child's life. The thought of such an operation filled the room with even more dread, but Margaret's determination to bring her son into the world was unyielding. She had already endured so much, but she understood, as few others did, that the future of the Lancastrian cause, and perhaps the future of England itself, was bound to the outcome of this night. Her resolve, though weakened by pain, was still strong enough to see her through this trial. The moment she had dreaded was now upon her, to give everything she had for the survival of her son, and to face the unspeakable, knowing the risks. By the early hours of the morning, the air in Pembroke Castle was thick with anticipation and fear. Margaret's labour, which had stretched into its second day, showed no signs of slowing, but her strength was dwindling. The midwives exchanged worried glances, their experience telling them that this birth would not be like any other they had encountered. Every scream, every laborious gasp for air, was a stark reminder of just how unprepared Margaret's body was for the task at hand. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Margaret fought on. Margaret's young, fragile body was pushed to its absolute limit. Her once vibrant spirit now felt heavy, crushed beneath the weight of exhaustion, pain, and the incredible physical demands of childbirth. She clung to the edge of consciousness, her senses dulled by the agony. It was a fight for survival, her own and that of her son. In the dimly lit chamber, the midwives worked tirelessly. The tools they used were primitive, but they had been honed by years of experience. They massaged her abdomen, repositioned her body, and whispered calming words as they guided her through the worst of the pain. But there was no disguising the truth. Margaret's life was in jeopardy. Each moment, it seemed, was a gift, and every labouring breath she took was one step closer to either salvation or catastrophe. Jasper Tudor, pacing outside the chamber, could hear the echoes of Margaret's suffering through the thick oak door. Each cry cut him to the core. He had never been a stranger to suffering. He had lost his own father, his brother, and countless friends in the bloody battles that had engulfed England for years. But to hear the pain of a young woman who had been thrust into this brutal world of dynastic politics and warfare, a girl who had already lost so much, was almost unbearable. He couldn't help but wonder if history was determined to take everything from their family. Could Margaret's son be the last hope for the Lancaster cause? Or would he, too, fall prey to the insidious forces that had plagued England for so long? Margaret's suffering was not just physical. Her mind, sharp as ever, could not escape the weight of the political turmoil that surrounded her. The Wars of the Roses were engulfing the nation, and Margaret, though still a child in many ways, knew that her survival and that of her son meant more than just personal endurance. They represented the final vestiges of a dying royal line, the Lancastrian bloodline, which was losing ground to the Yorkists with each passing day. As she lay there, straining against the pain, her thoughts drifted, however briefly, to the future. What would her son's life be like? Would he grow up to be a king? Would he, like his mother, be caught in the midst of a brutal civil war that would tear England apart? Then, in the quiet moments between contractions, Margaret caught glimpses of another world. A world of peace. A world where her son could sit on the throne, not as a symbol of struggle, but of victory. It was a fleeting thought, one that barely had time to take root before another wave of agony overtook her. But in that moment, it was enough to remind her why she had to survive, why she could not, and would not, allow this child, this future king, to die. If there was any way to hold on to hope, it was through the child she carried. As dawn approached, the midwives worked with renewed intensity. Their faces were grim, their hands stained with blood. This was no longer just a matter of bringing a baby into the world, it was a battle for life itself. The decision had been made. They would attempt a manual extraction, a procedure that carried a terrifying risk of death. Margaret's heart pounded as they prepared for the procedure. She could barely focus, her body racked with tremors and pain. The midwives, old hands at this dangerous task, performed the delicate operation, all the while praying silently that they would be able to save both mother and child. The minutes stretched like hours as Margaret lay there, her body shaking violently. Then, just when it seemed that the tension would break them all, a sound filled the room, a soft, weak cry. It was the first cry of her son, Henry Tudor, the future King of England. For a moment, there was silence. The midwives held their breath, unsure of what would come next. Margaret, barely conscious, struggled to stay awake, her mind clouded by exhaustion. But when she heard that cry, a tiny, fragile wail, something deep within her stirred. A sense of relief, of joy, mixed with the overwhelming weight of what she had just endured. She had done it. Against all odds, she had given birth to a son, her son, the one who would one day rise from this fragile beginning to claim a throne. The midwives quickly swaddled the baby and placed him on Margaret's chest. For a fleeting moment, before the haze of pain and exhaustion overtook her once again, she looked down at her son. He was small, fragile, and covered in blood, but he was alive. Henry Tudor had made it into the world, and with him, a new hope had been born for the Lancastrian cause. As they rushed the baby away to be cleaned and properly cared for, Margaret's heart fluttered with a mixture of love and fear. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, and there was no certainty about what the future held for her son. Would he survive the political chaos that surrounded him? Would he one day wear the crown of England, as her family had long dreamed? Margaret, still barely clinging to consciousness, could not know the answers. But in that moment, she held on to the most powerful truth of all. Her son had survived, and with his survival, so too had the future of the Lancastrian line. The weeks following Henry Tudor's birth were a blur of agony and recovery for Margaret. Her body, battered by the traumatic birth, began the slow, painful process of healing, though it would never fully return to its previous state. The damage she had endured during labor left her with permanent physical scars tearing, internal injuries, and a body forever altered by the violent demands of childbirth. The physician, Dr. Lewis Carlion, spoke in hushed tones about the long-term consequences, warning that Margaret's body would never be able to bear another child. At just 13 years old, Margaret's potential for future motherhood had been tragically cut short, a sacrifice made in the name of dynastic politics. Despite the grave toll on her body, Margaret's spirit proved unbreakable. She fought through fever and infection, enduring the pain with a determination that would come to define her. Her recovery was slow, but as the weeks passed, she grew stronger. However, the emotional and psychological scars were more complicated to heal. Margaret's nights were plagued with nightmares, dreams of the birth, of the pain, and of the fragility of the child she had brought into the world. She struggled to reconcile the intense love she felt for her son with the traumatic memory of his violent birth. Holding Henry, now a tiny infant, was bittersweet. He was her future, yet every moment with him reminded her of the suffering she had endured. In the quiet, isolated confines of Pembroke Castle, Margaret began to shift her focus. No longer simply a mother recovering from childbirth, she recognized that her survival and that of her son depended on more than just the passing of time. The world around her was changing rapidly, and her son was now the hope of the Lancastrian cause. Henry's birth had brought a renewed sense of purpose, not just to her, but to all those who supported the Lancastrian faction. The road ahead, however, was fraught with danger. In the midst of her recovery, Margaret began to turn her attention to the shifting political tides. The Wars of the Roses had already torn the kingdom apart, and the Lancastrian cause, already weakened, now found itself on the defensive. Henry VI, the Lancastrian king, was a monarch of diminishing power, and the Yorkists, led by Richard, Duke of York, were gaining ground. The tensions between the two factions had reached a boiling point, and with the birth of Henry Tudor, Margaret realized that her son had the potential to unite and lead the Lancastrians to victory, but only if he could survive. Margaret's political education began in earnest during this time. She had always been sharp, but her mind, once focused on her own survival and that of her family, now began to expand beyond personal concerns. She took it upon herself to learn the intricacies of court politics, statecraft, and diplomacy. With the help of Jasper Tudor, who had become her chief protector, and the counsel of the few remaining loyal Lancastrian supporters, Margaret began to understand the true power dynamics at play. Jasper, himself a product of the Yorkist rebellions, was well versed in the strategies of survival and loyalty. He became Margaret's unofficial tutor, guiding her through the tangled web of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties that defined the court. One of the most crucial lessons Margaret learned was the importance of perception. In a world where political fortunes could change overnight, appearances were everything. She carefully cultivated relationships with key figures, both in England and beyond, understanding that support could be bought or lost with the slightest misstep. Margaret was no longer just a grieving mother. She was becoming a shrewd political operator, quietly maneuvering behind the scenes to protect her son and the Lancastrian legacy. Her religious devotion also became a cornerstone of her political strategy. Margaret's intense faith, which had sustained her through the darkest moments of childbirth, now provided her with a sense of divine purpose. She believed that God had allowed her to survive the ordeal for a reason, that Henry's life, his future, was part of a larger, divinely ordained plan. This belief in a higher calling allowed Margaret to persevere through the difficult times ahead, and it gave her the strength to make the politically difficult decisions that would later shape her son's future. As her recovery progressed, Margaret's physical limitations became less apparent, but her emotional scars ran deep. The trauma of childbirth, coupled with the loss of her reproductive future, left her with a sense of isolation. She could never again experience the joy of bearing a child, and this loss weighed heavily on her. Yet, rather than retreat into despair, Margaret turned inward, channeling her grief and frustration into something far more powerful, a fierce, calculated determination to secure her son's place in history. Margaret knew that the danger to her son was constant. Henry, though safe in Pembroke for now, was still at the mercy of a volatile and dangerous political landscape. The Yorkists, under the leadership of Richard, Duke of York, had made significant strides in their quest for the throne, and the Lancastrians were increasingly on the defensive. Yet Margaret understood something that many others overlooked. The key to survival was not simply brute force or wealth. It was patience, manipulation, and understanding the weaknesses of those in power. Her experiences had hardened her, but they had also sharpened her political instincts. Margaret was no longer just a girl thrown into the chaos of war and politics. She had become a woman, one with a singular purpose: to ensure that her son would survive to claim the throne of England. And if that meant using every tool at her disposal, alliances, deception, and even her own charm, Margaret would do whatever it took to see her son crowned. In the years following Henry Tudor's birth, Margaret's political landscape became as complex and treacherous as ever. The Lancastrian cause, though symbolized by her son, was rapidly losing ground to the Yorkists, whose claim to the throne appeared stronger with each passing year. Henry VI's rule was increasingly unstable, his mental health failing, and the Yorkists were seizing every opportunity to solidify their power. In this unstable environment, Margaret made the pragmatic decision to marry once again not for love, but for survival. In 1458 AD, Margaret married Henry Stafford, a younger son of the Duke of Buckingham, in a quiet, politically calculated union. Stafford was a man of moderate power, with connections to the Yorkist faction but not an overwhelming loyalty to either side. Margaret's marriage to him was as much about securing her position as it was about ensuring her son's future. Stafford, while not an ideal match in terms of political allegiance, was useful in other ways. He brought with him military protection and the ability to shield Margaret from the growing power of the Yorkists, especially in the volatile period following Henry VI's incapacity to rule effectively. The marriage itself was simple, with little ceremony or fanfare, nothing like the elaborate unions of Margaret's youth. She was still weak from her traumatic birth and was grieving the loss of her previous, more passionate political alliance with Edmund Tudor. Stafford, though a man of influence, was not her first choice. The marriage was driven by necessity. The union ensured that Margaret's lands and her son's inheritance would remain intact, even as the political tides swirled wildly around them. For Margaret, the marriage to Stafford was an act of resilience. She learned quickly that survival in this world meant putting aside personal feelings and using marriage as a strategic tool to gain power and influence. Stafford, too, understood that the marriage was a political arrangement. As a Yorkist sympathizer, he had to tread carefully. While he was loyal to the Yorkist cause, Margaret's family's power and the potential future of her son could not be ignored, and that meant playing a delicate balancing act. In their union, Stafford provided military support, but Margaret retained control over her family's vast estates, ensuring that she and her son would not fall into the hands of the Yorkists. But the marriage, though pragmatic, was not without its complications. Stafford, despite his political pragmatism, was not always satisfied with the arrangement. There were growing tensions between them, stemming from Margaret's unwavering loyalty to the Lancastrians. For Margaret, however, her marriage to Stafford allowed her to focus on the bigger picture: her son's future. She began to weave a web of alliances, subtly manipulating her situation, never losing sight of the ultimate goal. Henry Tudor would one day take the throne. Her political ambitions remained at the forefront of her mind. As England slid further into chaos, Margaret sought out other avenues for support, cultivating relationships with influential figures from both sides of the conflict. She maintained secret communications with Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's queen, while also corresponded with Elizabeth Woodville, the queen consort of Edward IV, carefully aligning herself with those who could offer her son the best chance at survival. But her growing influence did not come without sacrifice. Despite the political protection Stafford offered, the marriage was not a happy one. Margaret continued to be separated from her son, who had been sent into the care of his uncle, Jasper Tudor, in Wales. Margaret's separation from Henry weighed heavily on her. She had spent only brief moments with him in the years since his birth, and each year that passed only deepened her grief. Though she threw herself into her political duties, she could not escape the painful knowledge that her son was being raised far from her, by a man who had become a stranger. This emotional distance was difficult for Margaret, but she understood its necessity. The longer Henry remained in Wales, the safer he would be from the dangers of the Yorkist-controlled England. The more time he spent under Jasper Tudor's protection, the more he would grow into a leader who could one day claim his birthright. But the constant strain of her political machinations and the loss of her maternal role weighed heavily on Margaret. She began to experience increasing anxiety about Henry's future. Would he survive the years of exile? Would the Yorkists attempt to eradicate him entirely, as they had done with so many other Lancastrian heirs? The fear of his death, his disappearance, or even worse, his capture, haunted her constantly. And yet, despite these fears, Margaret never wavered in her mission. She knew her son's future was intertwined with the fate of England, and her role as his protector and guide had never been more vital. As Margaret continued to build her network of allies, she also began to focus on strengthening her own position. Her knowledge of statecraft, diplomacy, and the power of female networks within the political sphere grew with each passing year. She understood that survival in this brutal world did not just rely on raw power or military might, but on the ability to persuade, manipulate, and outlast your enemies. She became a master at playing the long game, thinking not just about her immediate survival, but about the future, her son's future. And so, as the turbulence of England's civil war continued to unfold, Margaret's political acumen and ruthless ambition only sharpened. She was no longer just a grieving widow or a mother separated from her son. She was a survivor, one of the most formidable political figures of her time, quietly maneuvering through the chaos to ensure that her son, Henry Tudor, would one day sit on the throne of England. As Margaret's political machinations grew more sophisticated, the country around her was tearing itself apart. The Wars of the Roses had escalated into a full-scale civil war, with no side willing to back down. The Lancastrian cause, though supported by many, had lost ground in the face of a resurgent Yorkist faction. Edward IV, a strong and capable military leader, had seized the throne from Henry VI, further consolidating the power of the Yorks. As the fighting raged on, Margaret understood that the battle for the throne was not just about soldiers in the field, but about the hearts and minds of the people. Margaret's situation became increasingly precarious as the Yorkists solidified their control. With her son safely in Wales under Jasper Tudor's protection, Margaret was left to navigate a political landscape that was hostile to her cause. Her marriage to Henry Stafford, while useful in many ways, did little to secure her position in a nation that was swiftly slipping into the control of the Yorkists. Stafford, though a pragmatic political ally, was becoming increasingly disillusioned with his role in the political games of the time. He sympathized with the Yorkist cause and began to grow resentful of the loyalty that Margaret still held to the Lancastrians. The political tension between them became impossible to ignore. Stafford's disillusionment was not just a matter of personal grievances, but of the changing tides of power in England. Margaret, ever the strategist, knew that her marriage was a fragile alliance, one that could not withstand the weight of shifting political allegiances. Stafford's growing bitterness and his Yorkist sympathies posed a threat to her plans. Yet, Margaret remained focused on her ultimate goal, her son's return to power. She understood that Henry Tudor's claim to the throne, though tenuous, was the rallying point for the Lancastrian cause. His survival was paramount. With the death of Stafford in 1471, following a series of military failures and injuries sustained during the conflicts with the Yorkists, Margaret found herself a widow once again. The timing was suspicious, and many at court speculated that Stafford's death, though officially attributed to his war wounds, may have been a convenient outcome for those with ambitions of their own. His death freed Margaret from a marriage that had become increasingly strained and allowed her to turn her full attention to the future of her son. But Margaret did not mourn long. The loss of her second husband gave her the freedom to act more decisively in the years that followed. She understood that now was the time to position Henry as the rightful heir to the Lancastrian cause. Despite his exile in Brittany, Henry Tudor remained a symbol of the Lancaster legacy, and Margaret knew that as long as he lived, there would be hope for the return of the Lancastrians. The political game had changed, and Margaret's role in it had evolved. Though still emotionally distant from her son, whom she saw only a few times a year, Margaret worked tirelessly to ensure his safety and prepare him for the eventual confrontation with the Yorkists. The political landscape had become increasingly volatile. Edward IV's rule was now firmly entrenched, but the legitimacy of his reign was continually questioned. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's brother, was deeply suspicious of Henry Tudor's growing influence and the potential threat he posed. To the Yorkists, Margaret was a force to be reckoned with, a mother who would stop at nothing to restore her son's claim to the throne. Margaret's diplomatic skills flourished during this period. She fostered a network of spies, informants, and allies who kept her informed of every development in both England and Europe. Through carefully placed correspondences, she maintained clandestine communication with powerful figures, including those sympathetic to the Lancastrian cause, while appearing to remain neutral. Margaret's ability to navigate these turbulent waters was a testament to her growing political savvy. She knew when to act, when to wait, and when to align herself with the right people at the right time. She was playing a long game, one that required patience, stealth, and unwavering commitment to her son's future. Margaret also began to subtly shift the loyalty of key figures in the court, particularly those who were disillusioned with the Yorkist leadership. Her ability to read people, to understand the subtle power dynamics that shaped the kingdom, allowed her to form alliances that would one day pay off. Yet, her ambition was tempered by a quiet, calculating determination. She was not a woman who relied solely on her son's birthright to restore the Lancastrian cause. She knew that political power was fluid, and she was willing to sacrifice anything: her happiness, her relationships, her personal desires to see Henry crowned as king. The growing tension in England did not go unnoticed by Margaret. She saw the political winds shifting, and she began to plan. Her network of supporters was steadily growing, and it seemed that the time for action was fast approaching. She had spent years preparing for this moment, ensuring her son's survival and his eventual claim to the throne. Her role as the Queen Mother, though never officially recognized, was central to the Lancastrian struggle. Margaret's influence in the courts of Europe, particularly in France, was another important facet of her strategy. France, though embroiled in its own conflicts, was an ally of the Lancastrians, and Margaret used her connections there to secure vital support for her son's return. By the time of Edward IV's sudden death in 1483, Margaret knew the opportunity for her son's return was closer than ever. Edward's death plunged England into a political crisis. His young son, Edward V, was now king, but the boy king's reign was uncertain. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had seized power, and his usurpation of the throne sent shockwaves through the nobility. For Margaret, the news of Richard's coup was both a crisis and an opportunity. Richard's claim to the throne was deeply flawed, and his ruthless rise to power made him increasingly unpopular. The legitimacy of his reign was open to question, and Margaret saw this as the moment she had been waiting for. Her son, now in his early 20s, was the perfect alternative to Richard III, a young man with a legitimate claim to the throne and a rallying point for the Lancastrian cause. The time had come for Margaret to pull all the strings she had worked so carefully to set in motion. The Wars of the Roses were about to reach their bloody conclusion, and it would be Margaret, more than anyone, who would see her son claim the throne of England. In the summer of 1485, the long-anticipated moment finally arrived. Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, now a young man of 28, prepared to take the decisive step that could restore the Lancastrian dynasty to the throne of England. The political turmoil following the death of Edward IV and the controversial usurpation of Richard III had created a fragile situation, one that Margaret had spent years carefully orchestrating. The death of Edward IV had plunged England into a period of uncertainty. His son, Edward V, was too young to rule, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had seized the throne, becoming Richard III. But Richard's reign was tainted by suspicion, and the legitimacy of his rule was questioned by many. The mysterious disappearance of the two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, in the Tower of London, only deepened Richard's unpopularity. Margaret had been working behind the scenes for years, building alliances, gathering intelligence, and ensuring that Henry would have the support he needed to reclaim the throne. She had cultivated relationships with powerful nobles, merchants, and foreign allies who had grown disillusioned with Richard's rule. It was through these carefully constructed networks that Margaret's influence reached its zenith. By the time Henry Tudor was ready to make his move, he was not alone. He had supporters across England, many of whom had long been loyal to the Lancastrian cause. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of English history. In August 1485, Henry Tudor crossed the Channel from Brittany, landing in Wales to rally his supporters and begin his march toward England. His claim to the throne was tenuous, but Margaret's support and political maneuvering had ensured that he was now seen as the best hope for the Lancastrians to regain power. The journey to the throne was not going to be easy. Henry's army was small, and he would have to face Richard III's much larger, more experienced forces. Yet, it was in Wales, under the protection of Jasper Tudor and the Welsh rebels, that Henry found the courage and resources to press forward. He was not just fighting for himself, he was fighting for his mother's legacy, for the future of the Lancastrian cause, and for the throne of England itself. The night before the Battle of Bosworth, Henry received crucial support from Lord Stanley, a man whose loyalty had been hard to predict. Stanley, a man with immense military influence, had remained on the sidelines for much of the conflict, playing both sides. But Margaret, ever the strategist, had spent years cultivating her relationship with Stanley, subtly guiding his decisions without ever openly advocating for the Lancastrians. By the time of Bosworth, Stanley's allegiance was secured, and his forces were ready to strike at the decisive moment. On the 22nd of August, 1485, the armies of Richard III and Henry Tudor clashed at Bosworth Field. Richard, confident in his own ability to win, led his forces into battle. But the tide of fortune shifted quickly. As Richard's army fought valiantly, the defection of Lord Stanley's forces turned the battle in Henry's favour. The Yorkists, already weary from years of civil war, found themselves overwhelmed. Richard III, realising that his cause was lost, charged toward Henry in a final, desperate attempt to kill him. But the fate of England was already sealed. Richard was struck down in the heat of battle, his body left to be found on the battlefield, a grim symbol of the Yorkist defeat. The death of Richard III marked the end of the Wars of the Roses and the beginning of a new era for England. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, had triumphed. His victory at Bosworth was not just a military one, it was a political coup that ensured the survival of the Lancastrian line and the eventual founding of the Tudor dynasty. But for Margaret, the victory was personal. Her son had claimed the throne she had worked tirelessly to secure for him. The long years of political maneuvering, of sacrifice and loss, had culminated in this one moment. In the days following the battle, Henry VII made his claim to the throne official. Margaret's son was crowned king in a quiet ceremony, one that signified the restoration of the Lancastrian cause to the English crown. As Henry VII assumed his place as king, he married Elizabeth of York, thereby uniting the warring factions and putting an end to the decades-long conflict that had torn England apart. The union of the red and white roses, the emblem of the Lancaster and York houses, marked the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that would shape the future of England for centuries to come. But for Margaret, the culmination of her work was bittersweet. She had achieved her goal, her son was now king. Yet, the cost of that victory had been high. Her role as a mother had been forever altered by the years of separation from Henry, and the trauma of his birth still haunted her. Though she had seen her son rise to power, the personal cost of that victory, her own emotional and physical scars, was something she would never fully recover from. As Margaret looked upon her son's coronation, she understood that the triumph of the Tudor dynasty was not just about power, it was about survival, about navigating a brutal world where loyalty was fickle and where every move had consequences. Her journey from the young girl in the birthing chamber at Pembroke Castle to the queen mother of a newly crowned monarch was a testament to her strength, her political genius, and her unrelenting devotion to her son and his future. Margaret's life, though marked by personal sacrifice, culminated in the ultimate victory of her son, Henry VII, and the establishment of the Tudor dynasty. Her role as Queen Mother, though never officially recognized in a formal capacity, was a central one in shaping the early years of Henry's reign. As a mother who had borne the weight of a nation's hopes and had endured years of separation from her son, Margaret was now poised to become one of the most powerful women in England. Though Henry VII's reign began with triumph, it was not without its challenges. The kingdom was still reeling from the civil war that had nearly torn it apart, and Henry's claim to the throne was tenuous at best. Many of the nobles who had supported Richard III or had been loyal to the Yorkist cause now found themselves at odds with the new king. Margaret's influence became crucial in stabilizing her son's rule, for she not only held sway over those loyal to the Lancastrian cause, but also had the wisdom to maneuver through the volatile political environment that her son faced. In the early years of Henry VII's reign, Margaret worked tirelessly behind the scenes to secure her son's position. She continued to build alliances, both with the old Lancastrian supporters and with newly loyal Yorkists. Through shrewd diplomacy, she helped solidify Henry's claim, making sure that his position was secure not just through force of arms, but through strategic marriages, alliances, and political patronage. Margaret's letters, written in a diplomatic yet determined tone, were instrumental in maintaining the delicate balance of power. She kept herself informed on every move made by the nobles of England, learning from her son's mistakes and offering counsel that helped avoid political pitfalls. Margaret also played a key role in her grandson's future. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York had united the two warring factions, but the future of the dynasty rested on the birth of a son. Henry VIII, born in 1491, was the heir that Margaret had longed for, and his birth provided an additional layer of security to the Tudor dynasty. Though Margaret's influence in court politics began to wane as Henry VII became more secure in his rule, she remained a guiding force for the family. Her focus was on ensuring that Henry VIII would inherit a stable kingdom, one that would endure for generations to come. Despite her political successes, Margaret's personal life was often marked by loneliness and loss. The years of political maneuvering had taken a toll on her emotional well-being. Margaret had lived a life filled with grief. She had lost her first husband, Edmund Tudor, when she was barely a teenager, and she had been separated from her son for much of his youth. She had sacrificed her personal happiness and motherhood for political necessity, and the weight of that sacrifice never fully left her. Although her son's coronation had been the culmination of her political ambitions, Margaret's own heart never fully healed from the trauma she had endured. In her later years, Margaret became increasingly devout, spending long hours in prayer and seeking solace in the religious practices that had sustained her through the darkest times of her life. Her faith, which had first grown in the chapel of Pembroke Castle during her labour with Henry, became a refuge in her old age. Margaret often sought comfort in her relationship with God, believing that her enduring strength and ability to overcome such immense hardships were a testament to divine will. As the years passed, Margaret's health began to decline. She had always been frail, her body forever marked by the trauma of her early years, and the emotional toll of her life began to take its toll. Despite her declining health, Margaret remained steadfast in her belief in the Tudor cause and in the future of her family. Her sharp political mind never dulled, and even in her final days, she remained a respected figure at court, advising her son and her grandchildren on the complex world of royal politics. Margaret Beaufort, who had once been a young girl in the throes of an agonizing childbirth, became one of the most formidable women in English history. Her quiet resilience and political cunning had laid the foundation for the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that would forever change the course of England. Margaret lived to see her son establish his rule, and to witness the marriage of her grandson, Henry VIII, to Catherine of Aragon, a union that would eventually give rise to the English Reformation. In 1509, just days after Henry VIII's coronation, Margaret passed away. She had lived through incredible personal suffering, but in the end, she had seen the fruition of her dreams. The Tudor dynasty, born from the blood-soaked battles of the Wars of the Roses, was now firmly in power. Margaret's legacy was secure, not just as a mother and queen mother, but as a woman who had endured unimaginable pain to ensure the future of her family. Her death marked the end of an era, but her influence lived on through her son, Henry VII, and his successors. In Westminster Abbey, Margaret was laid to rest beside her ancestors, her tomb a testament to the extraordinary woman she had become. The inscription on her tomb reads simply, yet powerfully, "A mother of kings, a woman of unmatched strength, whose sacrifices changed the fate of England forever." Though she had never sought glory or recognition, Margaret's life was one of quiet but profound power. Her journey from a young girl in the throes of childbirth to the mother of a king and the founder of a dynasty remains one of the most remarkable stories of survival and determination in history. Her story, buried within the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, still echoes through history, a testament to the sacrifices made for the future of a nation. Margaret Beaufort's legacy, a life shaped by the struggles of motherhood, survival, and ambition, lives on in the monarchy she helped create, in the dynasty she founded, and in the hearts of all those who believe that even the most broken bodies and spirits can reshape the world. Edward IV's reign was brief but turbulent, a period that shaped not only the future of England, but the political survival of Margaret Beaufort. When Edward IV, a member of the Yorkist faction, seized the throne in 1461, it marked the beginning of a new, more dangerous era for the Lancastrians. Margaret, as the widow of Edmund Tudor and mother of the future king, Henry Tudor, was deeply entrenched in the Lancastrian cause. The Wars of the Roses were no longer a matter of distant skirmishes, but had now become a brutal, all-consuming conflict. During Edward IV's reign, Margaret's position was precarious. The Yorkists, while ruling with relative stability, did not forget the threat posed by the Lancastrian bloodline. Margaret, now a widow twice over and separated from her son Henry, had to navigate this complex and hostile environment. Her survival strategies became a masterclass in diplomacy, espionage, and the subtle art of political maneuvering. Margaret's correspondence, largely clandestine and handled through trusted intermediaries, allowed her to remain a key player in the ongoing struggle. She used her network to gather vital intelligence about Edward IV's movements, the loyalties of his allies, and the discontent simmering within his ranks. Margaret had learned the value of strategic alliances during her marriage to Henry Stafford, a Yorkist sympathizer who nonetheless saw the potential value in allying with the widow of Edmund Tudor. Despite his loyalties, Stafford understood that the Yorkist cause, while powerful, was far from secure. Margaret, for her part, could maintain her political standing by subtly manipulating her relationships and nurturing ties to individuals within the Yorkist court. But the death of Henry Stafford in 1471, from complications related to injuries sustained in a battle, represented a devastating blow to Margaret, both personally and politically. His death left her isolated once more, but it also marked a shift in the tides of the political game. Stafford's death provided Margaret with the freedom to more openly pursue her son's claim to the throne. With his passing, Margaret was no longer constrained by the political necessity of her marriage to a Yorkist sympathizer. She was now fully focused on securing Henry's future, utilizing her resources and allies to ensure that he remained a viable contender for the throne of England. The death of Stafford left Margaret in a vulnerable position, but it also freed her to act with greater determination. No longer shackled by marital obligations, she turned to the one person who held the future of the Lancastrians, in his hands her son, Henry Tudor. Margaret's resilience during this period was a testament to her ability to navigate the changing tides of power as she prepared for the eventual return of Henry Tudor to claim what she knew was rightfully his. Margaret's hopes for her son's return to England were finally realized in 1485, a pivotal year in English history. Henry Tudor, having lived in exile in Brittany for much of his life, was now ready to return to England and claim the throne. Margaret had spent years carefully laying the groundwork for this moment, forging strategic alliances and securing the support of key figures who could help him in his endeavor. Her role in ensuring Henry's return was more than that of a mother, it was that of a seasoned political strategist. Margaret's first crucial alliance was with the Stanleys, a powerful family with strong military connections. While Lord Stanley's loyalty to the Yorkists was well known, Margaret had spent years cultivating a subtle influence over him. She had worked tirelessly to ensure that the Stanleys would back her son at the right moment, and in 1485, that moment arrived. The Stanleys, with their significant military forces, pledged their support to Henry Tudor, a move that would prove to be one of the decisive factors in the Battle of Bosworth. The Battle of Bosworth, on the 22nd of August, 1485, was the culmination of Henry Tudor's struggle to claim the throne. Richard III, the last Yorkist king, stood in opposition, but he was fatally overconfident. His army was larger and better equipped, but the betrayal of the Stanleys, who turned the tide of battle in Henry's favor, sealed Richard's fate. As the battle raged on, Richard charged at Henry in a final desperate attempt to kill him, but the outcome was inevitable. Richard III was slain on the battlefield, his body left to be discovered in a humiliating position, and Henry Tudor emerged victorious. With Richard III dead and his forces scattered, Henry Tudor was able to claim the throne as Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. The Wars of the Roses, which had torn England apart for decades, were effectively over. The balance of power had shifted, and Margaret's son had emerged as the new king. For Margaret, this victory was the culmination of years of sacrifice and struggle. She had not only given birth to the future King of England, but had also spent a lifetime ensuring his survival and eventual triumph. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth not only secured his place on the throne but also ushered in a new era for England. The reign of the Tudors would bring stability to a kingdom ravaged by civil war, and Margaret, now the Queen Mother, would play a pivotal role in shaping the early years of her son's rule. But while the victory at Bosworth was a personal triumph for Margaret, it was also a profound political victory, one that proved her resilience, cunning, and determination to see her son crowned as the rightful King of England. After Henry VII's victory at Bosworth and his subsequent coronation, Margaret Beaufort's role in English history was far from over. As Queen Mother, Margaret's influence continued to shape the trajectory of her son's reign. Though Henry VII was now firmly established on the throne, England was still a kingdom recovering from the wounds of civil war. Henry's rule would be marked by a need for both consolidation and caution. He was fully aware that his claim to the throne remained tenuous and that his position was still fragile. Margaret, now a widow for the third time, found herself once again at the heart of political intrigue. She had never fully embraced the traditional role of a passive queen mother. Instead, Margaret used her position to cement her family's legacy, nurturing her son's reign while ensuring that the Tudor dynasty remained secure. Her influence was far-reaching, extending not just in England but also to foreign courts. Margaret's network of loyalists and allies was vast, and she continued to use her connections to secure her son's interests. As Henry VIII grew into manhood, Margaret's role began to shift. Though her influence at court was still significant, her son's marriage to Elizabeth of York and the birth of his heir, Henry VIII, meant that the dynasty was now firmly established. Margaret's legacy, however, would live on in the form of her grandchildren, particularly Henry VIII, who would go on to reshape England with his reign. In her final years, Margaret lived to see the Tudor dynasty firmly entrenched in power. As her health began to decline, she retreated from the political spotlight, focusing instead on her personal faith. Her last years were marked by a deepening sense of devotion as she turned to religion for solace and guidance. The trauma of her early life, the battles she fought for her son's throne, and the personal losses she had suffered all weighed heavily on her, but her faith became a source of strength in her final years. Margaret died in 1509, just days after her son's coronation as Henry VIII. She passed away knowing that her life's work had been fulfilled, that her son had not only ascended to the throne, but had secured the Tudor dynasty for future generations. Margaret's life had been a journey of immense personal sacrifice, but also of extraordinary political achievement. The sacrifices she made both as a mother and a political figure were ultimately rewarded, and her legacy endured through her son's reign and the changes he brought to England. Margaret Beaufort's story, marked by pain, loss, resilience, and ultimate triumph, remains one of the most remarkable in English history. Her strength and strategic brilliance shaped the foundation of the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that would forever alter the course of English history. Her legacy as the mother of Henry VII and grandmother of Henry VIII solidified her place as one of the most powerful and influential women of her time. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey bears a simple inscription, a tribute to the extraordinary woman who endured so much for her family and her country. But the true measure of Margaret's legacy is not in the words etched on her tomb, but in the dynasty she helped to build, a dynasty that would shape England for centuries to come.